Welcome to this deep dive, where we really try to unpack what you need to know on, well, on a pretty critical topic.
hmm
Today, we're zeroing in on the foundations for monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation in information security, specifically as it's defined in the ISO IEC 27004 standard.
Yeah, think of it as, laying the essential groundwork. So, not just hope that your security efforts are actually, well, working.
Exactly. If you've ever wondered how to really gauge if your security initiatives are effective, ISO 27004, especially these first few clauses, gives you that vital guidance.
That's right. And we're going to methodically walk through the first 7 clauses of the 2016 version, sort of like your instructors, trying to shed light on each core concept.
Okay, and just so we're clear, our source for this deep dive is the ISO IEC 27004.201 standard itself. Nothing else.
It's just the standard.
Our goal today is pretty straightforward. Take these potentially, let's face it, sometimes dense ideas and make them clear, understandable, and usable for you.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Where do we start? Clause 1.
Let's dive right in. Clause 1, scope. What's the fundamental purpose it lays out? What's it trying to achieve?
Right. Clause 1. It basically sets out why this document even exists. Its main purpose is to give organizations guidelines, practical advice on how to evaluate their information security performance.
Okay, performance.
And, crucially, the effectiveness of their information security management system, their ISMS.
Ah, the ISMS effectiveness too. Got it.
And it's important this guidance is specifically designed to help organizations meet the requirements laid out in ISO IEC 27001.201T.
The main standard, yeah.
Exactly. Specifically, Clause 9.1 of 27001, which is all about monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation.
So 27004 is basically the how-to guide for that specific bit of 27001.
You could say that. Yeah, it provides the practical details on how to actually do what Clause 9.1 requires.
Okay. And what are the main areas it says it covers?
Well, Clause 1 points to 3 main things. First, the monitoring and measurement of your actual information security performance.
Right. How well you're doing.
Second, the monitoring and measurement of how effective your ISMS is. And that includes both the ISMS processes themselves and the security controls you've implemented.
Processes and controls. Okay.
And third, the analysis and evaluation of all the results you get from that monitoring and measurement. What do you do with the data?
Right. Makes sense. Now, is this just for the really big companies, the ones with huge security teams?
Oh, absolutely not. Clause 1 is very explicit here. It says these guidelines apply to all types and sizes of organizations.
All types and sizes. Good to know.
Yeah, whether you're a tiny startup or a massive multinational, the basic need to understand how well your security is working and how effective your system is, that's universal.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's move to Clause 2, normative references.
Yeah.
What does that tell us? Are there other documents we absolutely have to follow?
Actually, Clause 2 is refreshingly simple for ISO 27004.201 scene.
Oh.
It states very clearly there are no normative references in this document. 0.
No normative references at all?
None. Think of it like, getting a recipe. Sometimes a recipe says, see page 5 of Cookbook X for the special sauce. That's like a normative reference.
Right. You need the other book.
Yeah. Clause 2 here is saying this recipe stands completely on its own. You don't have to go find any ingredients or instructions in other specific mandatory documents to follow this one.
Interesting. So unlike some standards that really build on others, this one is self-contained in that respect. That certainly simplifies things a bit.
It does.
Okay, moving on. Clause 3, terms and definitions. Where do we find out what all the specific jargon means?
Right. Clause 3 points us to the source. It says that for the purpose of this standard, ISO 27004, the terms and definitions given in ISO IC 27000 apply.
Ah, ISO 27000. That's the overview and vocabulary one for the whole family, isn't it?
Exactly. It's the master dictionary, if you like. By having definitions centralized in 27000, it helps ensure everyone's speaking the same language across all the related standards. That's pretty critical for consistency, and for audits.
Makes sense. Use the common dictionary.
Yeah, but keep in mind, these are often sort of high-level definitions. You'll still need to think about how they apply specifically within your own organization's context.
Good point. And does Clause 3 actually tell us where to find this ISO 27000 dictionary?
Yes, it does. Very helpfully. It gives the web addresses for the official databases maintained by ISO and IEC.
Okay.
There's the IEC Electropedia, which is at electropedia.org, and the ISO online browsing platform at iso.org/OBP.
Electropedia.org and iso.org go OBP.
Got it. Very practical.
Those are the official up-to-date places.
Great. Now let's look at Clause 4, Structure and Overview. How does this standard organize itself to help us make sense of it all?
Okay, Clause 4. Think of this as the roadmap for the standard itself. It explains how the document is structured, partly to help understanding, but also, as we said back in Clause 1, to align directly with those requirements in ISO 27001, Clause 9.1.
So it shows how the pieces fit together for that 9.1 requirement.
Exactly, it's showing you the logic. So what are the main sections it points to after these initial ones?
Clause 4 highlights the main clauses that follow it. Clause 5 is rationale, Clause 6 is characteristics, Clause 7 is types of measures, and Clause 8 covers the processes.
Rationale, characteristics, types, processes. Okay.
And it stresses that this order is deliberate. It's designed to guide you through a logical flow.
A logical flow.
Yeah.
How so? What's the thinking behind that order?
Well, Clause 4 suggests it starts with the why. That's the rationale of Clause 5. Why do we even need to do this evaluation?
Okay, start with the justification.
Right. Then it moves to what the characteristics in Clause 6, like what makes monitoring and measurement effective.
Yeah.
Then it gets into what kind of the different types of measures in Clause 7 you might use.
Performance versus effectiveness? Maybe we'll get there.
Exactly. And finally, it addresses how the actual processes in Clause 8 involved in putting it all into practice. So it's a journey from understanding why it's needed to understanding how to implement it.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. So understanding the why first gives you the foundation. Stops you just collecting data aimlessly, right?
Precisely. Avoids measurement for measurement's sake.
Clause 4 also mentions some annexes. It calls them informative annexes. What are they about?
Ah, yes, the annexes. They aren't mandatory requirements, but they provide extra help. Annex A gives a kind of conceptual model for measurement and shows how it links back to 27001 9.1 again.
A model.
Annex B sounds really useful. It's packed with practical examples of monitoring, measuring, analyzing, evaluating. It even suggests a template you could adapt.
Ooh, practical examples are always good. Annex B.
Definitely want to look at.
Okay.
And Annex C provides another set of examples, but using more of a free-form text style, so different ways to see it applied.
Good to know those resources are there. And there's a Figure 1 mentioned, too.
Yes, Figure 1. Clause 4 points it out as a visual aid. It basically maps the clauses of this standard, 27004, directly onto the specific requirements in 27001, Clause 9.1. Just helps you see the direct connections visually.
Okay, great overview of the structure. Let's dig into the why then, Clause 5. Rationale. Why is all this monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation stuff so critical for an ISMS?
Right. Clause 5 really gets to the heart of why these activities are non-negotiable for a truly effective ISMS. It kicks off by reminding us of the fundamental goal of any ISMS,
Which is?
protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. The classic CIA triad.
Right, the bedrock principles. But why isn't just having policies and tech in place enough? Don't they ensure that?
Well, that's exactly the point Clause 5 makes. Just planning and implementing ISMS activities, like putting controls in place, doesn't automatically mean you're achieving those core objectives. You don't know for sure.
Ah, so you need to check.
You need to check. That's where evaluation comes in. Clause 5 highlights that ISO 27001 itself includes requirements to assess whether the plans and activities are actually delivering the intended security results.
And this ties straight back to that clause in 9.1 of 27001 we keep mentioning, doesn't it?
Perfectly. Clause 5 explicitly links to 9.1, saying it requires organizations to evaluate both their overall information security performance and the effectiveness of their ISMS.
Okay.
It even gives a little nod towards Clause 7, which we'll get to, about the different types of measures you can use to do this evaluation. So Clause 5 is basically unpacking that 9.1 requirement, explaining why you need to know if your security is working.
And it gets quite specific about what exactly organizations need to figure out as part of this, right?
Oh yes, very specific. Clause 5 lists out the key things. ISO 27001 9.1 says you must determine, like, what specifically needs to be monitored and measured, including both your security processes and your controls.
So you have to define the what.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And you also have to define the methods you'll use for monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. And crucially, ensure those methods give you valid, reliable results.
Methods are key for validity. What else? It mentions timing and responsibility, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You need to figure out when the monitoring and measuring will happen, the frequency, who in the organization is responsible for doing it.
Right. Assign roles.
Then, when the results will be analyzed and evaluated,
Yeah.
and who is responsible for that analysis and evaluation. Plus, it stresses the need to keep documented information records as evidence that you've actually done all this.
Document everything.
And Clause 5 points out this links directly to Clause 8.9, which covers documented information requirements in more detail.
Okay. And a really important point you mentioned was the validity of results. Clause 5 says they need to be comparable and reproducible. Why are those two aspects so critical?
Yeah, that's fundamental. As Clause 5 explains, 27001 itself demands methods that produce comparable and reproducible results for them to be considered valid. Think about if you measure something today and get 5 foot, and measure the same thing next month and get 10, you need to know if that change is real or just because you measured it differently.
Like apples and oranges.
Exactly. If your results aren't comparable over time, or if two different people using the same supposed method get wildly different answers, then your data is unreliable. It's not telling you anything useful.
So how do you achieve that comparability and reproducibility? What does Clause 5 suggest?
It gives some key pointers. First, maintain a consistent scope and context for your measurements over time. If the underlying system changes dramatically, your old measurements might not be comparable anymore.
Keep the goalposts in the same place.
Sort of, yeah. It also advises caution if you change your measurement methods. Ideally, you'd run the old and new methods in parallel for a bit to prove the results are still comparable before switching fully.
Makes sense. What about fuzzier data, like feedback from surveys?
Good question. Clause 5 says if you're using subjective data, like from questionnaires or interviews, you need to establish really clear, defined criteria for how you evaluate that data. That helps make the assessment more reproducible.
Standardize the interpretation.
Right. And it also acknowledges that sometimes, especially with complex things, true reproducibility might only really happen when you aggregate the data, look at overall trends, rather than trying to replicate every single individual data point exactly.
Okay, so it's about ensuring consistency and reliability in our measurements. Now, Clause 5 wraps up by talking about the benefits. Why bother doing all this work? What are the payoffs?
Clause 5 lists some really significant advantages. First, better accountability. It shines a light on controls or processes that aren't working well, or maybe you're missing entirely.
Finds the weak spots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, it drives real improvement. By having quantifiable data, you can actually track progress in security performance and ISMS processes over time. See what's getting better.
Measurable progress.
Nice. Third, it provides solid evidence that you're meeting requirements, not just ISO 27001, but potentially laws, regulations, contractual obligations too.
Proof of compliance.
And finally, this is a big one, it supports much better risk-informed decision-making. Having quantifiable data helps you manage risks more effectively and allocate your limited security resources much more strategically.
So it's not just ticking boxes, it helps you make smarter security choices.
Absolutely. It's about driving real value and better protection.
Okay, the why is definitely clear now. Let's shift to Clause 6. Characteristics. What are the essential qualities or attributes of good monitoring and measurement?
Right. Clause 6 moves us into the what of monitoring and measurement. It starts by saying, look, these activities are your first step in evaluating performance and effectiveness.
The starting point.
Yeah, but then it immediately flags a major challenge, deciding what exactly to measure. Because honestly, there's a huge universe of things you could potentially measure in information security.
Overwhelming possibilities, and it warns against just measuring everything or measuring the wrong things, right? Why is that bad?
It does. Clause 6 points out that trying to measure too much or focusing on irrelevant stuff isn't just costly in terms of time and effort.
Which it definitely is.
But it can actually be counterproductive.
Yeah.
You risk drowning in data, and the really important signals, the critical issues, can get lost in all that noise. Or you might miss them entirely if you're measuring the wrong indicators.
So it's about focus, quality over quantity.
Definitely. It's not about the volume of metrics. It's about the insight they provide.
So if we shouldn't measure everything, how do we decide what to focus on? Where do we start?
Clause 6 gives clear guidance here. It says the absolute first step is to think about what the organization actually needs to know. What information do you need to understand your security performance and ISMS effectiveness? Define your information needs first.
Start with the questions you need answered.
Precisely. Once you know what information you need, then you can figure out the specific measures and the data required to provide that information. The core principle is measurement must always serve a defined information need.
Okay, that makes sense. Define the need, then find the measure. Now, Clause 6 distinguishes between monitoring and measurement. What's the difference?
Yeah, that's a useful distinction. Clause 6 defines monitoring as basically keeping an eye on things, determining the current status of a system, a process, or an activity to meet a specific information need. Are things running as expected? Are there alerts?
So monitoring is like watching the gauges.
That's a good analogy, yeah. Just observing the state of play.
Can you give some examples of what organizations typically monitor?
Sure. Clause 6 lists quite a few, though it says the list isn't exhaustive. Things like,
Hmm.
are ISMS processes being followed? How are incidents being handled? Is vulnerability management working? Configuration management status?
Hmm.
Security awareness training delivery?
Lots of operational things.
Yeah, plus event logs from firewalls, access controls, audit activities, risk assessment and treatment processes, third-party risk management, business continuity, physical security, system health.
Mm.
It's broad.
Okay, a wide range. And monitoring usually generates the raw data that then feeds into measurement. Is that right?
That's a key relationship. Clause 6 explains that monitoring often produces the initial data logs, interview notes, stats, incident details that you then use for more formal measurement.
Right.
And sometimes, to even figure out what measurable attribute you need, you might have to set up some additional monitoring just to collect that specific data first.
Okay. Clause 6 also mentions monitoring indicating when a risk has materialized and controls designed for monitoring.
Yes, good points.
It notes that ongoing monitoring can be how you spot that a risk you knew about has actually happened, which should then trigger your planned response.
Like an alert firing.
Exactly. And it also points out that some controls, like intrusion detection systems, for example, are specifically there to monitor things. When you use data from those controls for measurement, you need to be aware if the data was captured before or after any corrective action was taken, as that affects interpretation.
Context is key. Okay, that clarifies monitoring.
Right.
Now, what about measurement itself as defined in Clause 6? How's that different? So measurement, according to Clause 6, is a more specific activity. It's about determining a particular value or status or a trend related to performance or effectiveness. The main aim is to get quantifiable data that helps you spot potential improvements.
So it's more about quantification, finding a number or a level.
Pretty much. And it stresses that you can apply measurement to almost any part of the ISMS, processes, activities, controls, groups of controls.
And it gives that example from ISO 27701 about competence, right, to illustrate the difference.
Yes, that's a helpful one. It refers to the 27001 requirement 7.2c about ensuring people have the right competence.
Okay.
Clause 6 illustrates. You could monitor or do a simple performance check by just counting how many people attended a training session. That tells you the activity happened.
Right, simple count, performance.
But to measure effectiveness, you'd need to assess if those people actually learned what they needed to learn and can apply it, maybe through tests or observing fewer related errors later on. That gets at the impact.
That really clarifies performance versus effectiveness measurement. Good example. Does Clause 6 list other ISMS processes suitable for measurement?
It does. It gives examples like measuring aspects of planning, leadership involvement, risk management effectiveness, policy adherence, resource allocation, communication reach, management review outcomes, documentation quality, audit findings, basically the core machinery of the ISMS.
And when we think about measuring information security performance specifically, the focus often lands on the controls themselves, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Clause 6 highlights that security controls, whether individual ones, logical groups, or even the entire risk treatment plan, are prime candidates for performance measurement. This covers controls from Annex A of 27001, sector-specific ones like in 2070-10, controls from other frameworks, or any controls the organization has created itself.
So pretty much any control you've put in place, and what kinds of things about these controls might we measure? What attributes?
Clause 6 suggests measuring things like, how much does this control reduce the likelihood of an incident? Or how much does it reduce the potential impact or consequence?
Quantifying risk reduction.
Yes. Or how many times can a control handle an event before it gets overwhelmed or fails? Or how quickly can a control detect that something bad has happened?
Speed of detection. Okay,
Yeah.
useful metrics. Now, Clause 6 also gets practical about when all this should happen. What's the guidance on timing and frequency?
Right, the when. Clause 6 says organizations need to define their own time frames. These should be based on their specific information needs, the measures they're using, and how often the underlying data actually changes or becomes available its life cycle.
So it depends on the context.
Very much so.
Mm.
It also points out that you might collect raw data through monitoring quite frequently. maybe even continuously.
Like log collection.
Exactly. But the detailed analysis and formal reporting might happen less often, say, monthly or quarterly.
And reporting frequency depends on the audience and the data, too.
Yes. Clause 6 uses the example. A critical security breach might need immediate reporting, while overall trends in attempted network intrusions might be reported quarterly. You also need enough data collected over time to do meaningful analysis, like statistical analysis, and spot real trends.
Makes sense. Need enough data points. What about getting started? Do these processes need tuning?
That's a practical point Clause 6 makes. Your initial monitoring and measurement methods might need some testing and tweaking before the results are really reliable.
A bedding in period.
Kind of. It suggests setting limits on how long you spend fine-tuning and how long you collect initial data before you do the first formal analysis and evaluation. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, but do refine it.
And should timeframes change? Maybe if the environment changes.
Clause 6 says yes, measurement timeframes might need adjusting based on changes like, say, switching from manual data gathering to automated tools, which might allow more frequent collection.
Adapt to changes.
And it re-emphasizes the need for baselines. You need a starting point to compare against, especially if you change methods or look at trends over time. Oh, and while you can wrap all this into a formal measurement program, ISO 27001 doesn't actually require you to call it that or structure it that way.
Good clarification. Okay, last big piece of Clause 6, the who. Who is responsible for doing all this monitoring, measuring, analyzing?
Crucial question. Clause 6 states organizations must specify who is responsible. This could be specific roles, teams, or even individuals. And this needs to align with ISO 27001's requirements for roles and responsibilities, 5.3 and 9.1.
So clear ownership. Can it be automated?
Yes, it denotes activities can be manual, automated, or a mix. Clause 6 then suggests some potential roles you might define, though these aren't mandatory titles.
Okay, what kind of roles?
Things like a measurement client, the person or group who needs the information, a measurement planner who designs the measures, a measurement reviewer who validates the measures.
Planner, reviewer. What else?
An information owner owns the data source, might do the measuring. An information collector gathers the data. An information analyst crunches the numbers. And an information communicator reports the results.
Client, planner, reviewer, owner, collector, analyst, communicator. Quite a few.
Yeah, but it also says these roles can definitely be combined, especially in smaller organizations. One person might wear several hats.
Makes sense.
And importantly, people in these roles likely need a mix of skills, security awareness, and probably some specific training to do their jobs well.
Okay, that gives a really solid picture of the characteristics. Let's move to Clause 7, types of measures. You hinted at this earlier, performance versus effectiveness. Can you break that down?
Absolutely. Clause 7 gets right into these two key categories, which help evaluate, 1, how well you carried out planned activities, and 2, how effective those activities actually were. The two types are performance measures and effectiveness measures.
Performance and effectiveness. What's the core difference again?
Okay, performance measures, as Clause 7 defines them, are about the planned activity itself. They express results based on the characteristics of what you plan to do.
Like
How many people attended the training? Head count. Did we complete the firewall upgrade by the deadline? Milestone completion. What percentage of servers have the new patch implementation status? It's about doing the thing you planned.
So performance measures track execution, implementation. Did we do what we said we'd do?
Pretty much, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so what about effectiveness measures then?
Effectiveness measures look at the impact. Clause 7 defines them as expressing the effect of actually doing those planned activities on your main information security objectives. Did the activity achieve the desired outcome?
So effectiveness is about, did doing it actually make the difference we wanted?
Exactly. Did encrypting the laptops actually reduce data breaches from lost devices? Did the training actually lead to fewer phishing clicks? That's effectiveness.
And Clause 7 mentions these measures are often specific to the organization.
That's right, because objectives, policies, risks, and requirements vary so much between organizations, the specific performance and effectiveness measures you choose will likely be quite tailored. What's critical for one company might be less relevant for another.
Makes sense. It also clarifies something about the terminology in 27001, 9.1.
Yes, an important point. Clause 7 notes that while we talk about performance measures and effectiveness measures here in 27004, these are the building blocks. They contribute to the overall evaluation of information security performance and ISMS effectiveness that Clause 9.1 of 27001 requires. but the terms aren't exactly interchangeable. These are the tools you use for that broader evaluation.
Okay, so performance measures and effectiveness measures are the tools we use to assess the overall information security performance and ISMS effectiveness required by 27001.
Got it.
You got it.
So back to performance measures. Did we do it?
Hmm.
How are they typically used? Where does the data come from? Clause 7 explains they're really good for showing progress in just getting things implemented. ISMS processes, procedures, controls. They focus on whether implementation happened as planned.
Tracking rollout.
Exactly. And the data often comes from pretty standard sources. Meeting minutes, attendance sheets, project plans, output from automated tools like vulnerability scanners or configuration checkers,
Yeah.
things you might already be collecting.
Relatively straightforward data sources.
Often, yes. And Clause 7 strongly advocates for automating the collection, analysis, and reporting of these performance measures whenever you can. It saves effort, reduces cost, and cuts down on potential human errors.
Makes sense to automate where possible. It gives those examples too, like laptop encryption.
Right. Example 1 is measuring the percentage of company laptops with hard disk encryption. That's a clear performance measure. Once you hit 100% and maintain it, maybe your focus shifts elsewhere.
And the management review meeting attendance.
Yeah, example 2. For a new ISMS, you might track attendance at management reviews. Maybe it starts low, but the performance measure tracks improvement towards the target. Once attendance is consistently good, you might shift focus to measuring the effectiveness of those meetings. Are they actually driving good decisions?
Ah, so the focus naturally shifts over time from performance to effectiveness as things mature.
That's a key takeaway from Clause 7. Once most of your performance measures show controls are implemented and processes are running as intended, you should strategically put more emphasis on effectiveness measures. Are these things actually working?
But you don't just forget about performance measures entirely.
No, Clause 7 cautions against that. Performance measures can still be useful for spotting if a control starts to degrade or needs improvement later on. The emphasis shifts, but you don't necessarily retire them completely. And remember, 27001 REIT requires evaluating both and planned intervals.
Right, measure both. Okay, let's dive deeper into effectiveness measures. Did it work? What kind of insights do they give us?
Effectiveness measures, as Clause 7 explains, tell you about the real-world impact of your security efforts, your risk treatments, your processes, your controls on achieving your security goals. Do they operate as intended? Do they produce the desired outcomes?
And what kind of outcomes can they quantify?
Well, depending on your objectives, Clause 7 suggests they could quantify things like actual cost savings from the ISMS, maybe compared to the cost of incidents, or the level of customer trust gained or maintained, or progress towards other specific security objectives the organization has set.
So, linking security activity to business or strategic outcomes, how do organizations usually create these effectiveness measures? It sounds a bit more complex than just counting things.
It often is more complex, requiring a more integrated view. Clause 7 says effectiveness measures often combine data from automated tools with data collected manually from ISMS activities. You need to track different things and be able to link specific ISMS activities to actual security events or outcomes.
Connecting the dots, what capabilities do you need for that?
Clause 7 outlines a few key things. First, you need to be able to evaluate how well controls were implemented in the first place using those performance measures.
Okay, step 1.
Then you need ways to collect data from both your automated tools and your manual ISMS activities. You need the ability to take data from these different sources and normalize it, get it into a comparable format for analysis.
Handle diverse data.
Right. And then, crucially, you need the skills to analyze that combined data, interpret what it means, and report the insights clearly to decision makers. Tell the story the data reveals.
Analysis and communication are key, and these insights are valuable for management.
Extremely valuable, usually. Clause 7 highlights that effectiveness measures really show the value information security brings to the organization. That's often what top management is most interested in, the return on security investment.
Okay. And Clause 7 gives some examples here, too. Something about vulnerabilities.
Yes. Example 3 talks about using an effectiveness measure to determine the organization's actual risk exposure from unpatched vulnerabilities, noting how often vulnerability exploitation leads to breaches. It's not just about patch deployment performance, but the resulting reduction in exploitable risk effectiveness.
Right. The outcome. And the training example.
Example 4 looks at training effectiveness. Going beyond just attendance performance, it suggests assessing if trainees actually understood the material and are applying it. This might involve post-training tests, yes, but also maybe correlating training records with incident data involving human error or analyzing help desk calls related to the training topic.
Seeing if the behavior actually changed. These examples really nail that difference between activity and impact. Okay, wow, we've covered a lot of ground in these first 7 clauses.
We certainly have. Clauses 1 through 7 really do lay down the essential foundation, the bedrock, for how to think about and structure monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation in your ISMS.
So just to quickly recap that journey, Clause 1 set the scope, why 27004 exists and who it's for, linking to TOEFN 7001. Clause 2, normative references, importantly, there are none. Clause 3 pointed us to ISO 27000 for terms and definitions.
Right. Then Clause 4 gave us the structure, that logical flow from why to how, and mentioned the helpful annexes. Clause 5 dug deep into the rationale, the why, covering the CIA triad, the need for evaluation, the specifics of 27001's 9.1 requirements, validity, and the benefits.
Then Clause 6 explored the characteristics starting with information needs, defining monitoring versus measurement, giving examples, and covering the crucial when and who.
And finally, Clause 7 broke down the types of measures, the key distinction between performance measures and and effectiveness measures.
Yeah.
Did it make a difference?
So these first 7 clauses really set the stage, defining the what and the why before we get into the detailed how.
Exactly. They established the framework and the principles for building a truly insightful evaluation system for your information security.
And just as a little teaser for next time, the following clauses in 27004, starting with Clause 8, will really get into the how, the actual processes involved in putting all these concepts into practice.
That's right. Clause 8, for instance, goes into detail on the processes for identifying information needs, selecting measures, collecting data, analyzing it, reporting it, and crucially, reviewing and improving the whole measurement process itself. It gets very operational.
Fascinating stuff. Really highlights how critical a data-driven approach is for modern information security. So for you listening, as you think about your own organization's security management, maybe consider which of these foundational elements we've discussed today presents the biggest challenge for you.
Good question. Is it clearly defining your scope, nailing down your information needs, getting a handle on measuring effectiveness, not just performance?
Yeah, think about where the opportunities lie. How could a clearer understanding of these first 7 clauses of ISO 27004 help you develop more insightful and ultimately much more effective security practices in your own context? Definitely some food for thought there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.